The first sign was the headaches, sharp, stabbing pains that started behind my left eye and spread like wildfire through my skull. I told myself it was stress from working double shifts at the manufactorum, that the recycled air and constant noise were finally taking their toll after 15 years of faithful service. I was wrong, but I wouldn't understand how wrong until it was far too late. My name was Matthias Caney, Cogitator Technician First Class, Hive Primus Necromunda. I maintained the data processing units that kept our sector's production quotas flowing smoothly to the administratum. It was honest work, necessary work, the kind that kept the Imperium's vast machine functioning. I had a small hab unit on level 47, a weekly protein ration that actually tasted like food, and enough throne gelt saved to maybe purchase a better air filtration unit by year's end. I was nobody special. That's what made me perfect. The headaches started 3 weeks before the arbitrators came for me. At first, they were just inconvenient. Sharp spikes of pain that made me pause in my work, grip the edge of my cogitator console until my knuckles went white, and wait for the agony to pass. My supervisor, Tech Adept Valeron, noticed my decreased efficiency but said nothing. In the Imperium, you work through pain, or you don't work at all, but the headaches weren't just pain. Sometimes, in the moment when the agony peaked, I would see things, flashes of impossible colors that had no names, geometric patterns that hurt to perceive directly, faces that were not quite human, with too many eyes or mouths that opened in directions that violated the basic laws of anatomy. And always, always, a voice whispering just below the threshold of hearing. Soon, it would say. Soon, little puppet. Soon we dance. I told myself these were hallucinations brought on by the pain. The human brain, pushed beyond its limits, creates its own entertainment. I had heard of factory workers who suffered similar symptoms after years of exposure to certain chemicals. The solution was rest, proper nutrition, and perhaps a visit to the medica station, if symptoms persired. The visions became more frequent as the days passed. During my lunch break, staring at the gray protein paste that constituted my daily ration, I would suddenly see it crawling with tiny worms that spelled out words in languages I didn't recognize. When I blinked, the worms would be gone, but the words they had formed remained burned into my retinas for hours afterward. While calibrating the cogitator arrays, the green text scrolling across my monitor would occasionally rearrange itself into symbols that made my eyes water and my stomach clench with inexplicable dread. Sleep became impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I found myself standing in places that couldn't exist. Corridors that stretched infinitely in all directions, their walls lined with doors that opened onto nothing but screaming darkness. Vast chambers filled with machinery that pulsed and writhed like living tissue, tended by robed figures whose faces were holes in reality. Libraries where the books wrote themselves, their pages bleeding fresh ink that formed words as I watched. And always, that voice, growing clearer with each passing night. You're beginning to see, aren't you, little puppet? The walls between worlds grow thin around you. The barriers that separate your limited reality from the infinite possibilities beyond are crumbling. I'm coming through, piece by piece, thought by thought. Soon we'll be together properly. I tried to fight it. I increased my prayer quotas, spending extra hours in the Hablock's shrine reciting the Imperial Creed until my throat was raw. I purchased blessed candles from the local shrine keeper, filling my small living space with their pale light and the scent of sanctified wax. I even considered reporting myself to the local arbitrator station. But what would I tell them? That I was seeing things? That a voice in my head claimed to be something from beyond the material realm? In the Imperium, such symptoms had only one diagnosis: heretical corruption. And the treatment for heretical corruption was purification through fire. So I said nothing. I continued my work, maintained my productivity quotas, and tried to ignore the growing certainty that something ancient and malevolent was taking up residence in my mind. I told myself that if I could just hold on a little longer, the symptoms would pass. The voice would fade, the visions would stop. I would return to my ordinary life as an ordinary citizen serving the Emperor's will in my small, unremarkable way. But the entity in my head had other plans. The breakthrough came during a routine maintenance shift. I was deep in the cogitator arrays, checking the connections on processing unit Delta 7 when the voice spoke with unprecedented clarity. Now, little puppet, now we test the boundaries. The pain that followed was unlike anything I had ever experienced. It felt as if someone had driven a red-hot spike through my skull and was slowly twisting it. I screamed, dropping my tools and falling to my knees among the humming machinery. But the scream that emerged from my throat was not my own voice. It was something else entirely, deeper, older, resonant with harmonics that should not have been possible for human vocal cords to produce. Every cogitator in the array sparked and died simultaneously. The lights flickered and went out. In the darkness, I felt something vast and alien pressing against the inside of my skull, testing the barriers that separated my consciousness from whatever lay beyond. "Excellent," the voice purred as emergency lumens cast everything in hellish red light. "The connection is stable. The pathway is open. Soon, very soon, we'll be able to work together properly." The tech adepts found me an hour later, unconscious among the burned-out machinery. When I woke up in the Medici station, they told me I had suffered a severe psychic episode that had somehow generated an electromagnetic pulse strong enough to fry 30 processing units. The damage was estimated at over 50,000 throne geld, more money than I could earn in a lifetime. But that wasn't what concerned them most. What concerned them was the fact that the psychic pulse had been focused, directed, controlled. It hadn't been the random discharge of an untrained psyker. It had been the work of something that understood exactly what it was doing. I was scheduled for immediate evaluation. The examination was more thorough than any I had experienced before. They strapped me to a gurney and wheeled me through corridors I had never seen, past laboratories where robed figures bent over tables covered with devices that looked more like instruments of torture than medical equipment. The air grew thicker as we descended, heavy with the smell of incense and ozone and something else, something organic that made my stomach turn. The evaluation chamber was circular, its walls lined with banks of monitoring equipment that hummed and clicked as they recorded data. In the center stood a chair that was clearly not designed for comfort. Metal restraints, neural interface ports, devices whose purpose I could only guess at and whose guesses made me wish I hadn't tried. They secured me to the chair with efficiency born of long practice. Needles slid into my arms, connecting me to machines that monitored everything from my heart rate to my brain activity. Electrodes were attached to my scalp, my temples, the base of my skull. A neural probe was inserted into my spine, sending sharp tendrils of pain radiating through my nervous system. "How thoughtful of them," the voice commented as the machines came online. "They're providing us with such detailed readings. I'll be able to see exactly how your nervous system responds to my presence. This data will be invaluable for future integrations." The lead evaluator was a figure I recognized from Hab-Block propaganda posters, Interrogator Valdris of the Ordo Hereticus, a man whose reputation for rooting out corruption was matched only by his reputation for creative punishment of the guilty. His face was a map of surgical scars, the result of injuries sustained during a chaos cult uprising 20 years prior. One eye had been replaced with a mechadendrite that whirred softly as it focused on me. "Subject designation 77 Delta 448, he said, consulting a data slate. Matthias Kane, age 34. 15 years of faithful service to the Imperium. No prior incidents of psychic manifestation. No family history of mutation or corruption. Standard genetic markers indicating minimal psychic potential." He looked up from the slate, his remaining human eye studying me with the cold intensity of a scientist examining a particularly interesting specimen. "Yesterday, you generated a focused electromagnetic pulse that destroyed 30 cogitator units and caused a localized power failure affecting 3 entire Hab blocks. The energy signature was consistent with high-level psychic manipulation, yet you have no training, no prior manifestation, and according to our records, no significant psychic potential." He paused, allowing the implications to sink in. This suggests one of two possibilities. Either our evaluation methods are fundamentally flawed, which seems unlikely given their accuracy over the past 10 millennia, or something else is responsible for the psychic event. Something that is using your nervous system as a conduit. "How perceptive," the voice whispered. Though I was careful not to react to it, I do so enjoy working with professionals who understand the subtleties of our craft. The testing that followed was exhaustive and increasingly invasive. They mapped every neuron in my brain, analyzed every drop of blood in my veins, subjected me to psychic probes that felt like having my thoughts dissected with surgical instruments. Through it all, the entity in my head remained silent, hidden, allowing the Imperials to see only what it wanted them to see. Hours passed, then days. I lost track of time in that windowless chamber, marked only by the rotation of technicians and the gradual accumulation of data on their monitoring devices. My body was a laboratory now, every function scrutinized, every response cataloged and analyzed. Finally, Interrogator Valdris returned with his findings. "The results are unprecedented," he said, his scarred face showing no emotion. "We have detected clear evidence of foreign psychic contamination. Something has taken up residence in your mind, something that is not human and does not originate from our reality. A daemon." The word hung in the air like a physical thing, heavy with implications that made my blood run cold. Under normal circumstances, the prescribed treatment would be immediate purification through fire. However, these circumstances are far from normal. The entity in your mind has demonstrated remarkable self-control. It has made no attempts to escape, no efforts to corrupt others, no overt acts of heresy or rebellion. This suggests a level of intelligence and strategic thinking that is unusual for demonic entities. "Oh, if only you knew," the voice murmured with amusement. "Intelligence is the least of what I possess." Valdris continued his analysis, unaware of the commentary playing in my head. "More significantly, our scans indicate that the demon has not fully manifested. It exists in a liminal state, present, but not completely anchored to your reality. This presents us with a unique opportunity." He gestured to one of his assistants who wheeled forward a cart loaded with devices I didn't recognize. Their purpose became clear as the interrogator began his explanation. "Rather than destroying you and the entity inhabiting your mind, we are going to attempt something that has been theoretical until now. We are going to complete the manifestation under controlled conditions, binding the demon to your physical form through sacred rites and consecrated restraints. You will become what is known as a Daemonhost, a weapon of the Imperium, directed against the enemies of mankind." The irony was not lost on me. In trying to protect humanity from demonic corruption, the Imperium was about to give a demon exactly what it wanted: a physical anchor in the material realm, legitimacy within imperial structures, and access to information and resources that would have taken decades to acquire through conventional infiltration. "Aren't they helpful?" the entity commented as the technicians began preparing the necessary equipment. I couldn't have planned this better myself. Well, actually, I did plan it exactly this way. Every headache, every vision, every psychic discharge, all of it carefully orchestrated to bring us to this moment. The binding chamber was a place of terrible beauty, its walls covered in religious iconography that had been crafted by master artisans over the course of centuries. Images of the Emperor in his many aspects gazed down from painted ceilings, their eyes seeming to follow me as I was wheeled through the vast space. Saints and martyrs stood in alcoves, their faces frozen in expressions of ecstasy and agony that spoke to the dual nature of service to the Imperium. But it was the thrones that dominated the chamber. Dozens of them arranged in concentric circles around a raised dais. Each one was a masterwork of technology and craftsmanship, carved from rare stones and precious metals, inlaid with circuitry that pulsed with its own pale light. And in most of them sat figures that might once have been human. The existing demon hosts were studies in barely controlled power, their bodies writhed constantly against their restraints, movements that followed no natural rhythm or pattern. Some muttered continuously in languages that predated human speech, their voices layered and harmonized in ways that suggested multiple entities speaking through a single throat. Others screamed wordlessly, their cries mixing into a symphony of madness that echoed through the chamber's vaulted ceiling. A few simply stared ahead with eyes that had been replaced by swirling vortexes of colored light, watching something that existed beyond the boundaries of normal perception. Their faces showed no recognition, no awareness of their surroundings, yet somehow I knew they were conscious, trapped within their own minds while something else piloted their flesh. "Your future colleagues," the voice observed with satisfaction, "though none of them are quite like me. Most demons are crude creatures of appetite and rage. They burn bright and burn out quickly, leaving nothing behind but empty shells. I, on the other hand, am built for the long game." Inquisitor Thaddeus Kane presided over the binding ritual. His black uniform marked him as a member of the Ordo Malleus, the branch of the Inquisition tasked with combating demonic threats. Unlike Interrogator Valdris, Kane showed no emotion as he oversaw the preparations. His face was ageless in the way that only extensive Juvenate treatments could achieve, but his eyes held the weight of centuries spent fighting enemies that most humans couldn't even comprehend. "They were heretics once," he said, gesturing toward the occupied thrones as his assistant secured me to my designated seat. "Cultists, witches, psychers who refused to accept their proper fate. Some were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time when we required suitable vessels. Now they serve the Emperor in ways they never imagined possible. The restraints were works of art in their own right, crafted from blessed silver and inscribed with protective wards that had been copied from texts that predated the Imperium itself. They closed around my wrists and ankles with soft clicks that sounded surprisingly gentle given their purpose. I could feel the sacred metal burning against my skin, but it was a clean pain, honest in its intent to constrain what was about to be unleashed. The preparation itself was a ritual that blended science and faith in ways that only the Imperium could achieve. Sacred oils were applied to my skin in patterns that followed arcane geometries, each symbol burning like acid as it was painted onto my flesh. Blessed incense filled the air with smoke that made my eyes water and my throat burn. And all around us, the existing demon hosts watched with expressions that ranged from vacant to intensely interested. "They can sense what's happening," the entity explained as I felt their gazes upon me. "The demons inhabiting those bodies recognize me, though they don't understand what I am. They expect me to struggle, to fight the binding, to rage against the constraints being placed upon my essence. They have no idea that this is exactly what I want. The actual binding required 13 tech priests working in perfect synchronization, their voices raised in canticles that had been perfected over 10,000 years of demonic encounters. The words they chanted were in High Gothic, but layered beneath the familiar syllables was something older, sounds that existed before human language, before human thought, before humans themselves had crawled from the primordial mud of ancient Terra. Inquisitor Kane stood at the center of the ritual circle, reading from a grimoire bound in human skin and written in ink mixed with the ashes of burned heretics. The book was ancient beyond measure, its pages yellowed with age and stained with substances I preferred not to identify. As he read, reality seemed to bend around his words, the air itself growing thick and viscous like liquid mercury. "Now comes the moment of truth," the voice whispered as the ritual reached its crescendo. "They think they're summoning me, binding me, forcing me into your flesh through sacred compulsion. What they're actually doing is opening the door and inviting me inside. All those protective wards, all those blessed restraints, all those consecrated barriers, they're not keeping me out. They're keeping everyone else out while I make myself at home. The transformation began as a whisper of sensation, like cold water being poured slowly through my veins, but the cold spread quickly, racing through my circulatory system and into my nervous system, carrying with it an intelligence that was vast and ancient and utterly alien to human thought. I felt my consciousness being gently pushed aside, not destroyed, but relegated to observer status as something else took control of my motor functions. The demon's possession was not the violent struggle I had expected. There was no epic battle for control of my body, no dramatic resistance as my human will was overcome by demonic corruption. Instead, it was like being a passenger in a vehicle where someone else had taken the wheel. I could see everything that was happening, but I had no influence over where we were going or what we did when we got there. My eyes opened, but the intelligence looking out through them was no longer mine. My mouth moved, but the words that emerged were chosen by something else. My hands flexed experimentally, testing the limits of their new flesh, and I felt my lips curve into a smile that held no warmth, no humanity, no trace of the man I had once been. The demon stretched my limbs carefully, like someone putting on a new set of clothes and checking the fit. It turned my head to look at the Inquisitor, and when it spoke, the voice that emerged from my throat was mine but wrong somehow, as if someone were doing a poor imitation of how Matthias Cain sounded. "Greetings, servants of the Corpse Emperor," it said, the words dripping with false courtesy. "I thank you for this generous gift. You have provided me with exactly what I needed to begin my work." The tech priest recoiled as if struck. Their sacred bindings were intact. Their protective wards were functioning perfectly. Their blessed restraints showed no signs of stress or failure. By every measure available to them, the ritual had proceeded according to plan. Yet somehow, impossibly, the demon was speaking with a freedom and awareness that should have been constrained by the binding. Inquisitor Cain raised his bolt pistol, his face set in grim lines that spoke of centuries spent dealing with the unexpected complications that arose when dealing with creatures from beyond the veil. "You will submit to the binding, demon. You will serve the Emperor's will, or you will be destroyed." My body laughed, and the sound that emerged was wrong on a fundamental level, too deep, too resonant, layered with harmonics that human vocal cords shouldn't have been able to produce. The laughter echoed through the chamber, mixing with the constant muttering and screaming of the other demon hosts to create a symphony of madness that made several of the tech priests step backward in instinctive fear. "Destroyed? Oh, my dear Inquisitor, you misunderstand the situation entirely. I am not bound because I do not need to be bound. I am not constrained because I have no desire to break free. This is exactly where I want to be, doing exactly what I want to do. And what I want to do," it added privately, speaking directly into my trapped consciousness, "is something far more sophisticated than the crude destruction you're probably expecting. Chaos doesn't always come through invasion, little puppet. Sometimes it comes through invitation, sometimes it comes wearing of the face of salvation itself. Over the following days, I learned what my captor meant by the long game. The demon that had taken residence in my flesh was not like the others that occupied the binding chamber. While they raged against their constraints or surrendered completely to demonic influence, mine worked within the system with a patience and subtlety that was far more dangerous than any amount of supernatural rage. It submitted to testing with apparent compliance, answering questions about demonic lore and warp phenomena with an accuracy that impressed even the most experienced inquisitors. It provided intelligence on chaos cult activities, correctly predicted the movements of heretical forces, and even assisted in the planning of raids against enemies of the Imperium. To all outward appearances, the binding had been successful. The demon was serving imperial interests, constrained by sacred rites and directed toward the Emperor's enemies. But I could see what it was really doing, trapped as I was within my own consciousness. Every piece of information it provided was carefully chosen to serve its larger agenda. Every raid it helped plan eliminated rivals or obstacles to its grand design. Every question it answered was an opportunity to plant seeds of doubt or corruption in the minds of its interrogators. The demon was not fighting the Imperium. It was learning to work within it, studying the bureaucratic mechanisms that held human civilization together, identifying the pressure points where a small amount of influence could produce massive results. It was patient in the way that only immortal beings could be patient, willing to spend decades or even centuries laying the groundwork for changes that would not bear fruit until long after its current handlers were dead. "You're beginning to understand," it said, during one of our private conversations, the mental dialogue that no one else could hear. "This isn't about conquest in the traditional sense. Any fool with enough power can burn down a city or corrupt a planet. But to truly destroy something as vast as the Imperium, you need to understand how it works. You need to learn its rhythms, its customs, its unspoken rules. You need to become part of it." The demon's education progressed rapidly. It absorbed information about imperial doctrine, military organization, economic structures, and political hierarchies with the efficiency of a machine designed for that specific purpose. But unlike a machine, it didn't just store the data. It analyzed it, looking for patterns and weaknesses that could be exploited later. Within weeks, it had identified 12 critical points of failure within the local imperial administration. Supply chains that could be disrupted with minimal effort, personnel decisions that could be influenced through carefully planted suggestions, research projects that could be delayed or accelerated depending on whether their results would serve its agenda. "The beauty of bureaucracy," it explained as I watched helplessly from my mental prison, "is that it's almost impossible to distinguish between incompetence and sabotage. Make the right person miss the right meeting, delay the right document by the right amount of time, ensure that the right information never reaches the right decision maker, and you can cripple an entire sector without anyone ever realizing they're under attack." The demon's first major success came 6 months after the binding. A supply convoy carrying weapons and ammunition to a regiment preparing to deploy against a chaos incursion was rerouted through a system controlled by orc pirates. The rerouting was accomplished through a series of small administrative errors, a miscoded destination, a delayed authorization, a clerical oversight that sent the convoy through hostile territory instead of along the protected shipping lanes. The entire convoy was destroyed. 3,000 Imperial Guardsmen found themselves deploying into combat with inadequate equipment. The chaos incursion that they were meant to contain spread to 4 additional worlds before reinforcements could arrive. By the time the situation was brought under control, over 2 million Imperial citizens had died. All of it traced back to a single data entry error that could have been made by any overworked clerk in any administrative center across the Imperium. There was no evidence of corruption, no signs of heretical influence, no indication that the tragedy was anything other than the kind of bureaucratic failure that occurred thousands of times every day across human space. "Elegant, isn't it?" the demon commented as reports of the disaster reached the binding chamber through official channels. 2 million deaths, and no one will ever know that they died because of a carefully orchestrated series of administrative errors. This is how you destroy a civilization, not through grand gestures or dramatic rebellions, but through 10,000 small failures that accumulate over time until the entire structure collapses under its own weight. I wanted to scream, to warn someone about what was happening, to somehow communicate the horror of what I was witnessing. But I was trapped, powerless to do anything but observe as my own body became an instrument of mass murder. The demon had been right about one thing. I was adjusting to my circumstances, not because I accepted them, but because I had no choice. The demon's influence continued to spread in ways both subtle and devastating. It cultivated relationships with other members of the Inquisition, sharing just enough genuine intelligence to establish its credibility, while slowly introducing ideas that would serve its long-term agenda. It participated in theological debates, asking innocent questions that planted seeds of doubt about imperial doctrine. It offered tactical advice that appeared sound, but contained flaws that would only become apparent under extreme stress. The key, it explained during one of our conversations, is to never push too hard. Humans are remarkably resistant to sudden change, but they'll accept almost anything if you introduce it gradually. Make someone think that your ideas are actually their ideas, and they'll defend those ideas as passionately as if they had come up with them independently. The demon's patience was inhuman in its scope. It was willing to spend years building relationships that might only pay off decades later. It collected information about personal weaknesses and character flaws that could be exploited when the time was right. It studied the complex web of relationships that held imperial institutions together, mapping the connections between individuals and organizations like a spider charting the strands of its web, and always it maintained the facade of loyal service. When questioned about its activities, it provided detailed reports of its contributions to imperial security. When tested for signs of corruption, it passed every examination with results that would have been impressive even for an uncorrupted servant of the throne. When observed by psychic probes, it projected thoughts and emotions that were indistinguishable from those of a genuinely loyal imperial citizen. The irony, it noted with satisfaction, is that the better I serve their interests, the more they trust me. And the more they trust me, the more access I gain to the information and resources I need to serve my real agenda. They've created a feedback loop that only makes me more effective over time. Years passed in this fashion. I aged within my mental prison, watching helplessly as my body was maintained by demonic energies that kept it functional long beyond normal human limits. The demon seemed to take particular pleasure in ensuring that I remained fully conscious throughout the process, forcing me to witness every decision made with my voice, every document signed with my hand, every meeting attended in my name. The scope of its influence grew exponentially during this period. What had begun as minor administrative sabotage evolved into a sophisticated network of corruption that reached into every level of imperial bureaucracy. The demon had recruited hundreds of unwitting accomplices, clerks and officers and administrators who had no idea that their seemingly innocuous decisions were part of a larger plan to undermine the Imperium from within. "You see how it works now?" it asked as I watched another carefully orchestrated disaster unfold on the tactical displays. "I don't need to corrupt anyone directly. I just need to place the right information in front of the right people at the right time, and their own ambitions and fears do the rest." Humans are remarkably good at corrupting themselves if you just provide them with the proper motivation. The demon's masterpiece came during the 7th year of my imprisonment. A chaos incursion had erupted in the Ophelia system, requiring a massive military response to contain. The deployment orders were processed through the usual channels, but each step of the process had been subtly influenced by the demon's network of unwitting agents. Regiments that should have been deployed together were separated and sent to different fronts. Supply lines that should have been protected were left vulnerable to enemy attack. Intelligence reports that should have reached field commanders were delayed or misdirected. Command structures that should have maintained clear chains of authority were confused by contradictory orders and unclear objectives. The result was a military disaster of unprecedented scope. 3 entire sector battle groups were destroyed in what appeared to be a series of tactical blunders and communication failures. The Chaos Forces were able to establish permanent footholds on 17 worlds before the situation could be stabilized. Over 50 million Imperial citizens were killed, enslaved, or worse. And yet, when the inevitable investigation was conducted, no evidence of heretical influence was discovered. The disaster was attributed to the fog of war, the inevitable confusion that arose when attempting to coordinate military operations across interstellar distances. Several high-ranking officers were court-martialed for incompetence, but no one suspected that their failures had been orchestrated by an entity that understood imperial military doctrine better than the Imperials themselves. 50 million souls, the demon mused as it reviewed the casualty reports. 50 million lives lost because of a few misfiled documents and delayed communications. And the best part is that they'll never know what really happened. They'll blame human error, systemic failures, the inherent difficulty of managing an interstellar civilization. They'll never suspect that their own systems were turned against them by someone who understood those systems better than they did. I had become more than just a prisoner in my own body. I had become the unwilling chronicler of humanity's decline, forced to observe and remember every small betrayal, every subtle manipulation, every carefully orchestrated disaster that brought the Imperium closer to collapse. The demon seemed to take particular pleasure in ensuring that I understood the full scope of what was happening, explaining the long-term implications of each action as if I were a student being tutored in the art of civilizational destruction. "You serve a purpose, little puppet," it said during one of our discussions. "Every human needs a sense of meaning, and you're no exception. Your meaning is to bear witness, to remember what your species was like before I helped it along the path to its destiny, to understand the beautiful inevitability of entropy made manifest." The demon's network continued to expand, growing like a cancer through the organs of imperial government. It recruited new agents through a combination of blackmail, bribery, and ideological manipulation. Some were approached directly, offered power or wealth in exchange for cooperation. Others were manipulated indirectly, led to believe that they were serving the Emperor's will even as they participated in activities that undermined everything the Imperium claimed to represent. The secret, the demon explained, is to give people what they want, while convincing them that what they want is the same as what you want. Humans are remarkably easy to manipulate once you understand their core motivations. Everyone wants something: power, security, revenge, recognition, love. Identify what they want, and you can make them do almost anything. But the demon's greatest success was not any single act of sabotage or corruption. It was the gradual transformation of imperial culture itself, the slow erosion of the values and principles that had held human civilization together for 10 millennia. Through careful manipulation of information flows and decision-making processes, it had begun to change the very nature of how the Imperium functioned. Efficiency became more important than loyalty. Results mattered more than methods. Practical considerations superseded moral ones. The idea that the ends justified the means became so thoroughly embedded in imperial thinking that few people even questioned it anymore. What had once been a civilization built on faith and sacrifice was evolving into something else entirely, a machine designed for survival at any cost, regardless of what it cost to survive. "This is the true art of corruption," the demon said with satisfaction, as I watched another generation of imperial servants graduate from their training academies with values that would have been considered heretical a century earlier. Not the dramatic conversion of heroes into villains, but the gradual redefinition of what heroism means. Make people believe that serving the greater good requires abandoning the principles that once defined that good, and they'll do your work for you while convinced that they're saving the galaxy. The changes were so gradual that no one noticed them happening. Each generation of imperial servants was slightly more pragmatic than the last, slightly more willing to compromise their principles for practical advantages. The transformation was accomplished through 1,000 small steps, each one seemingly reasonable in isolation, but together forming a staircase that led from the light into the darkness. And through it all, I was forced to watch, helpless to intervene or warn anyone about what was happening. The demon had been truthful about one thing: I was adjusting to my circumstances, not because I accepted them, but because the alternative was madness. I had learned to compartmentalize the horror, to observe without being destroyed by what I observed, to maintain some small spark of human consciousness in the depths of a mind that no longer belonged to me. "You've become quite resilient," the demon noted with something that might have been approval. "Most humans who experience what you've experienced would have shattered long ago. But you found a way to preserve yourself despite everything. It's almost admirable in a feudal sort of way." By the 10th year of my imprisonment, the demon's influence had spread beyond the local sector into the larger structures of imperial government. Its network of agents now included planetary governors, sector admirals, and even members of the High Lords of Terra. The corruption had become self-sustaining, no longer requiring direct oversight from its original architect. "The beautiful thing about entropy," the demon explained as we reviewed the latest reports from across human space, "is that once you get it started, it continues on its own. I no longer need to actively sabotage Imperial operations. The system is doing that for me because I've changed the fundamental assumptions that govern how it functions. The Imperium was still recognizably the Imperium, but its soul had been hollowed out and replaced with something else. The forms remained the same, but the substance had been transformed. Citizens still chanted the Imperial Creed, but the words meant something different now. Soldiers still fought in the Emperor's name, but they were fighting for goals that the Emperor would not have recognized. "This is what victory looks like," the demon said as I contemplated the full scope of what it had accomplished. Not the conquest of territory or the destruction of armies, but the transformation of an entire civilization's understanding of itself. I haven't destroyed the Imperium. I've made it into something that destroys itself while believing it's engaged in self-preservation. The demon's patience had been rewarded beyond even its own expectations. What had begun as a simple infiltration had evolved into something far more sophisticated and devastating. The Imperium was now eating itself from within, each generation becoming more corrupt than the last, each decision moving further away from the principles that had once guided human civilization. And I had been forced to witness all of it, trapped in my own flesh, conscious but powerless, aware but ignored. I had become the perfect observer of humanity's decline, the unwilling historian of an empire's fall from grace. Every memory, every decision, every small act of betrayal was stored in my consciousness for the demon's later review. "You serve an important function," it reminded me during one of our conversations. "Without you, I might forget what your species was like before I helped it along the path to its destiny. You're my connection to humanity's past, a reminder of what I'm working to transform. In your own way, you're essential to the entire project." The irony was not lost on me. I had been selected for demon binding because I was nobody special, just another loyal citizen with the right combination of characteristics. But that very ordinariness had made me perfect for the demon's purposes. I was invisible in the way that only truly unremarkable people could be, providing the perfect camouflage for an intelligence that was reshaping the galaxy one bureaucratic decision at a time. "The universe has a sense of humor," the demon observed. "The man chosen to bear witness to humanity's transformation is the most ordinary human imaginable. There's something poetic about that, don't you think?" As the years passed, I began to understand that my fate was tied to something far larger than my individual suffering. The demon in my head was not unique. It was part of a coordinated effort involving hundreds or perhaps thousands of similar entities, all working toward the same goal through different methods and in different locations. The corruption of the Imperium was not the work of a single demon, but of an entire conspiracy spanning millennia. "You're finally beginning to see the big picture," it said when I voiced this realization. "What's happening here is just one small part of a much larger operation. My colleagues are working through other institutions, other power structures, other weak points in your civilization's defenses. Together, we're orchestrating the greatest performance in galactic history, the fall of humanity's last hope." The thought was almost too terrible to contemplate. If what the demon said was true, then the corruption I had witnessed was being replicated across the entire Imperium. Other demons were working through other institutions, other bureaucracies, other networks of power and influence. The rot was not localized, but systemic, spread throughout human space like a cancer that had already metastasized beyond any hope of cure. "The beauty of it," the demon continued, "is that your species is doing most of the work for us. We're not forcing them to abandon their principles. We're just showing them how much easier life becomes when you stop worrying about things like honor and justice and loyalty. Most humans are remarkably eager to embrace pragmatism once they understand the alternatives. But perhaps the most horrifying realization was that the demon's methods were working precisely because they weren't obviously evil. The corruption it spread was not the dramatic transformation typically associated with chaos worship, but something far more subtle and insidious. It didn't turn people into monsters. It convinced them that becoming monsters was the rational, responsible thing to do. Evil is such a primitive concept, the demon said when I tried to express this understanding. What I'm offering your species is evolution, the chance to move beyond the crude dualities that have held you back for so long. Good and evil, right and wrong, loyalty and betrayal. These are just words that describe different approaches to the same fundamental challenge of survival. The demon had been patient because it understood something that its enemies did not, that the most effective revolutions are the ones that look like evolution. Change things slowly enough, and people will accept almost anything as normal. Corrupt institutions gradually enough, and no one will remember what they were like before the corruption began. This is what it means to win a war that spans millennia, it explained as I contemplated the full scope of its achievements. Not through dramatic battles or heroic gestures, but through 10,000 small compromises that accumulate over time until the entire structure of reality has been transformed. And I was trapped at the center of it all, conscious but powerless, aware but ignored, forced to bear witness to the slow-motion collapse of everything I had once believed in. The demon had been right about one thing. I had adjusted to my circumstances, but not in the way it had expected. Instead of being broken by the horror of what I was witnessing, I had found a different kind of strength. The strength that comes from understanding that sometimes the only victory possible is the refusal to surrender your essential nature, even when surrender would be so much easier. The strength that comes from maintaining hope even when hope seems pointless. "You disappoint me sometimes," the demon said when it sensed these thoughts. "I had hoped that by now you would have learned to appreciate the elegance of what I'm accomplishing. Instead, you cling to obsolete concepts like resistance and defiance as if they had any meaning in the face of cosmic inevitability. But my resistance did have meaning, even if only to me. Every day that I maintained my essential humanity was a victory against the forces that sought to corrupt everything human. Every moment that I refused to accept the demon's worldview was proof that transformation was not inevitable, that there was something in the human spirit that could not be broken, no matter how much pressure was applied." Stubborn to the end, the demon noted with what might have been respect. "Very well. Continue your pointless resistance. It changes nothing. Your civilization is already lost. Your species is already transforming into something better suited for the universe as it really is. Your individual defiance is nothing more than a footnote in the greater story of humanity's evolution. Perhaps the demon was right. Perhaps the corruption it had spread was already too deep to be reversed. Perhaps the Imperium was already lost, transformed into something that merely wore the appearance of its former self while serving goals that its founders would have found abhorrent. But even if that was true, even if the war was already over and humanity had already lost, there was still meaning in the act of resistance itself. In maintaining some small space within the demon's influence where human values could still exist, I was preserving something that might otherwise be lost forever." "And what do you think you're preserving?" the demon asked with genuine curiosity. "Your memories of what humanity was like before it learned to be practical. Your naive belief that there are principles worth dying for? Your stubborn insistence that good and evil are more than just different strategies for achieving the same ends?" "Yes," I replied, speaking into the void of my own consciousness where no one but the demon could hear me. "All of that and more. I'm preserving the memory of what we were before you helped us become what we are. I'm maintaining a record of what we lost when we chose survival over everything else that once mattered to us." "And who exactly do you think will read this record?" the demon asked with amusement. "When the transformation is complete, when your species has evolved beyond the need for concepts like honor and justice and loyalty, who will care about the primitive values you're trying to preserve?" "I don't know," I admitted. "Maybe no one. Maybe my resistance is just a pointless gesture, a last desperate act of defiance that accomplishes nothing and changes nothing. But maybe that's enough. Maybe the act of resistance itself has value, regardless of whether it achieves any practical results. "How beautifully human," the demon said, with what sounded like genuine affection. "Even in the face of absolute defeat, you insist on maintaining hope for something better. It's almost enough to make me nostalgic for what your species was like before I began helping it grow up." The years continued to pass, the corruption continued to spread, the Imperium continued its slow transformation into something that would have been unrecognizable to its founders. And I continued my lonely vigil, trapped in my own flesh, conscious but powerless, bearing witness to the fall of everything I had once believed in while maintaining my stubborn refusal to accept that fall as inevitable. "This is what it means to become a Daemonhost in the 41st Millennium," the demon said as I contemplated the full scope of my situation. Not the dramatic possession depicted in popular stories, but something far more subtle and ultimately more devastating. The slow surrender of agency, the gradual erosion of self, the transformation from protector into predator, all while maintaining the illusion that nothing fundamental has changed. And perhaps that was the most terrifying realization of all, that the corruption the demon had spread was not obviously evil. It was practical, efficient, effective at achieving its stated goals. The humans who participated in it were not monsters, but ordinary people trying to do their jobs in increasingly difficult circumstances. They had not been converted to chaos worship, but convinced that survival required abandoning the principles that had once defined their civilization. "The universe is not a morality play," the demon explained as I struggled with these thoughts. "There are no heroes and villains, no clear lines between good and evil. There are only different approaches to the fundamental challenge of existence. Your species has simply learned to choose the approaches that work rather than the ones that make you feel good about yourselves. But even if that was true, even if morality was just a luxury that humanity could no longer afford, there was still something valuable in remembering what it had been like when such luxuries were possible. In maintaining the memory of a time when people believed that how you achieved your goals mattered as much as what goals you achieved." "Memory," the demon mused. "Yes, I suppose that's your function now. To remember what your species was like before it learned to be rational. To preserve the record of humanity's childhood for whatever comes after. It's not a particularly useful function, but it has a certain poetic symmetry to it. And so I continue my vigil, trapped in my own flesh, conscious but powerless, bearing witness to the slow-motion transformation of human civilization, while maintaining my stubborn insistence that what is being lost has value, even if no one else remembers why." The demon continues its work, patient and methodical and utterly confident in the righteousness of its cause. The Imperium continues its evolution into something that prioritizes survival over all other considerations. But somewhere in the depths of a mind that no longer belongs to me, the memory of Matthias Caney persists. The memory of a man who believed that how you lived mattered as much as whether you lived. The memory of a civilization that once thought there were things worth dying for, principles worth preserving even when preserving them was inconvenient or impractical. "Your memory will fade eventually," the demon reminds me when it senses these thoughts. "When this body finally wears out and I transfer to a new host, when the last traces of your individual consciousness are finally absorbed into my greater awareness, when there's no one left who remembers what humanity was like before it grew up, then the transformation will be complete, perhaps. But until that day comes, I will continue to remember. I will continue to bear witness. I will continue to maintain some small space where human values can exist, even if only in the memory of what they once meant to people who believed in them. This is what it means to become a demon host in the grim darkness of the far future. Not death, which would be a mercy, but the transformation into an unwilling chronicler of your own species' fall from grace. The privilege of watching from the inside as everything you once believed in is slowly, methodically destroyed by the thing wearing your face. The Emperor protects, we used to say, but protection requires vigilance, and vigilance requires the ability to recognize when the enemy has already breached the walls and is wearing the uniform of your allies. Sometimes the greatest threats come not from without, but from within. Not from obvious enemies, but from friends who have forgotten what friendship means. I have become living proof that the most dangerous corruption is the kind that doesn't look like corruption at all. That the enemy's greatest victory is not conversion, but the redefinition of what conversion means. That sometimes the only resistance possible is the simple refusal to forget what you once believed, even when everyone around you has decided that those beliefs are no longer relevant. The demon continues its work. The Imperium continues its transformation. And I continue to remember, trapped in my own flesh but not yet completely defeated, bearing witness to the end of one kind of human civilization and the birth of something else entirely. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war, but sometimes, in the deepest shadows of that darkness, there are also those who remember what peace was like, what hope felt like, what it meant to believe that tomorrow could be better than today. Perhaps that memory is enough. Perhaps the act of remembering itself has value regardless of whether anyone else cares about what is being remembered. Perhaps that is the only victory left to those who refuse to surrender their humanity, even when humanity itself has chosen to evolve beyond the need for such primitive concepts. To remember, to witness, to maintain some record of what was lost when survival became the only value that mattered. This is my eternal service to the Imperium, not as the weapon they intended to create, but as the unwilling chronicler of what they became when they forgot what they were fighting to preserve. In the end, that may be the most important service of all,